Well, thanks, Paul, for your invitation. It was with great pleasure that I accepted it. I mean, I will never pass on the opportunity to learn more about what EraValue is doing. The only thing was, I immediately said yes. But my heart was kind of in two modes here. I was at two hearts on this issue. Because I was thinking, what am I going to tell this lot that they don't already know? I mean, they know more than I do about these things. So it's a bit daunting to give a keynote speech to a community who's a community of experts. Then I also thought, well, you know, it's easier to do the framing and to talk the big talks than then to go and do the research. So that to some extent, my job is the easiest job of all the jobs that are going to be done today. And so with this happy thought, I thought, yeah, I can do this, yeah. And I thought, I'm going to do two main things. I will emphasize the diversity within the arts and humanities. And then I will consider how this diversity affects our approach to evaluation and our approaches to the assessment of public value. And from here, we'll consider how these different methods affect the role of evaluation. In a way, the methodology you use suggests that there is an objective for evaluation, that is a specific objective. And again, this specific objective for evaluation suggests a way of doing public policy. So it's a strange thing here in which you start considering a specific methodology almost as if it was a kind of a research question, and you end up, it's the thin end of the wedge. You end up thinking about really how policy should be defined. And this is more or less the kind of track I'm going to try to follow over the 30, 40 minutes I have available. The start of the story, we know it very well, is this issue of the new, so-called the new social contract for science. This question that has already been referred to, that policymakers are now asking for evidence of the returns to what now they call their investments in science and in research. And to an extent, this is not new. I mean, there has always been, politicians, somebody said, never deviated from the expectation that science would yield some instruments, that science would be instrumental. That's always been the case. But what has changed is the way in which this expectation is translated into policy practice. From expecting that research from itself would yield these instruments, and that you better not mess up with the scientists doing their work, because if you mess up with their work, the quality of the research at the end will be less, and if it's less, the results, the practical results, will also be less. So leave the Republic of Science to work as a Republic of Science, and things will just be dandy. So from this perspective, which in a way, it's reflected in a famous quote from Madame Curie, that's 1921, I'm reading the quote, 1921, so it's 91 years old, and she said, scientific work must be done for itself, for the beauty of science. That's nice. And then there is always a chance, it's always a chance, that is kind of, that the scientific discovery may become a benefit for humanity. And so this kind of a statement, in which I guess many scientists today would still support this view. But this kind of a statement was already, politicians were quite comfortable also with this. But from some point on, this comfortability ended. And politicians started to think maybe that this chance that the scientific discovery might yield results was not maybe enough to justify the investments that were being made. And so a shift took place, a shift that, as Paul has said, took place over many, many years, but there was an increasing interest in results. This is what is implied when we talk about the new social contract of science, and this is what people have referred to as the emergence of a new research regime. Now, what implications? This has implications for the role of science and scientists, and has implications for the role of evaluation. So first of all, how does this new perception affect the role, the standing of the arts and humanities? And here, scholars in the arts and humanities tend to be quite concerned with this new environment. And there are reasons for this. There is a well-known study of the arts and humanities in the UK conducted by the Centre for Business Research, University of Cambridge, part of a much bigger analysis of university-industry relationships. And there, what comes up is that a large number of arts and humanities scholars see their research as basic. And many saw that it had no relevance in the survey. And the study concluded, second quote of the day, that academics from the arts and humanities are much more likely than those in other disciplines to report that their research is of no relevance for external organizations. They are less likely to have had their research applied in commercial context, but are more involved in research with relevance for non-commercial external organizations. So, this is all not bad news. This fits with the understanding we sort of have about the differential aspects of application and use in arts and humanities. The study also found important differences within the arts and humanities, to which I will soon return. But this view fits with another problem, which is the concerns that scientists, arts and humanities scholars have about the way in which they are perceived by politicians. This is connected, it's not quite the same. So here the problem is this view, as somebody said, that arts and humanities are perceived as a superficial ornament, quote unquote. The perception that they are facing a silent crisis. There is a famous book going around. I know it's famous because it comes quite high up in the Amazon.com rankings. Not for Profit, Martha Nussbaum, professor of law and psychology, University of Chicago. And in Not for Profit, it's basically an attempt at defending the old values and arts and humanities facing this push towards the university for growth, for commercialization, this view that commercialization would push away the soul of the university, of academia, away from the traditional values that should be defended. And my third quote of the day, and I think it's going to be the last one, I don't do this very much, but that I thought it was interesting. She stated that arts and humanities are, quote, seen by policymakers as useless frills. At a time when nations must cut away all useless things, where you introduced the session, in order to stay competitive in the global market. And as you said about cutting useless things in Ireland, or not useless things, about cutting things. In Ireland and in Spain, we know a lot. Must cut away all useless things in order to stay competitive in the global market. They are rapidly losing their place in curricula. Nations prefer to pursue short-term profit by the cultivation of the useful and highly applied skills suited to profit-making. So what the book is arguing, in a way, although this term is not used in the book, is that the arts and humanities are a victim of the new social contract. The new social contract is seen as akin to commercialization and as the introduction of a logic focused on economic growth that is not germane to the objectives that have normally been attributed to the arts and humanities. So one thing that first we have to consider about this position is that this kind of argument will tend not to convince those that they are not predisposed in favor of it in the first place. So sometimes I carry this facade life, and when I get bored, I tend to look at the comments in the internet. And Not-for-Profit has a heck of a lot of comments. And I picked up one which I thought was concise for the criticism. Said this book shows the intellectual narcissism of the humanities in America at full display. So this is a nasty business. There's a lot of quite heated arguments. And to an extent, because there's a perception that some of this can be a special pleading. And is observed as a group of scientists, of scholars, a special pleading for their area, and basically against another group, a special pleading for their area, in which it is basically a zero-sum game. If one wins, the other loses. And so there's a heated confrontation. So here we are. So my feeling is that in this heated confrontation, it would be good to stay away of these kind of general statements about the situation of the arts and humanities that the Not-for-Profit book makes. I see there's a problem in saying we are different and these guys are attacking us. I think it has to be a bit more nuanced And here I will return to the CBR study I just mentioned, which is quite explicit about the important differences that there are within this area. And for instance, it mentions creative arts and the media. Scholars in this field see their research as user-inspired. So they are very user-oriented. It's applied. They are highly commercial and highly connected in their work. Instead, they compare this with working languages, and scholars in languages tend to see their research, they say, as of little relevance. And I bet that if you had picked up this group of scholars in language of little relevance, you would have found tribes, groups within it, that probably look more like the group of creative arts and media, that were probably very commercial in their outlook. I'm sure that within every group, there's also a lot of diversity. And besides, this problem is not unique to the arts and humanities or to the social sciences. In the hard sciences, we find it in the same way. You know, one thing is theoretical physics, or number theory, okay, which I don't think has, although some people then talk about cryptography, but in principle, number theory doesn't seem to have many clear direct applications, very theoretical. And another thing is biomedicine, which is basically led by an object of relevance. And it's structured to comply with this objective of doing relevant research. So there is diversity everywhere. And the problem we are facing is how to deal with diversity. We can always discuss whether the grouping we have done of our disciplines as a subject of research is the correct grouping. Is arts and humanities really, you know, homogeneous enough to deserve a consideration as an object of research? Is social science and humanities really a group that you should be addressed in research as such, as a group? And that's a problem that hits me very deeply, because we had a manuscript turned down by a referee who insisted our manuscript was about social science and humanities, and the referee insisted that by no means should ever social science and humanities be considered under the same umbrella. They were so different that you should set them apart. And that was it. Nothing else could be said. And the referee was very stubborn, so was I. We lost. And my thing is here, I am quite pragmatic. And I would suggest that the subject of research as such has to be defined to suit our specific research objectives. You know, in this field, our research objectives are policy-led. We are really dealing with policy problems. And because we are dealing with policy problems, the subject is presented to us in the way it is institutionally managed. So the reason why the Center for Business Research, Cambridge, does a study on arts and humanities is not because they have considered in a big, deep epistemological study there is something of conversion between the arts and humanities. No. It is because it has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And they address the areas that the Arts and Humanities Research Council address. And I think this is fine. You know, so we will not be able to extract ourselves from this problem that we will have to deal with heterogeneous groups. And I remember there was a whole issue of research policy. As Magnus is there sitting, he edited an issue of research policy, very quantity, but the whole thing was about, the main message was the heterogeneity in university-industry relations. So heterogeneity, how to deal with heterogeneity is an important problem, is the main problem maybe we face when we think about the role, the way we do evaluation. So how do we do that? Well, a possibility would be by aggregation. And if we aggregate and we try to count, if we take quantitative studies, then we may observe patterns that if we were just looking at the stories, we might not observe them. We might not have been aware of them. So we'll maybe for commonalities, we look for patterns, we look for causalities, and this is done within a quantitative approach of analysis. And if we do that, then we can find even more commonalities. You know, in this CBR study, again, it comes up that, in fact, there are areas in which the arts and humanities are not so different from the natural sciences. So if you look at it from that perspective, you can see even more commonalities. And so, for instance, they say that the patterns of connections, and the patterns of connections are very important, are very similar across all the sciences, except for community-based connections. So I have taken quite a roundabout way to argue that there is this tension between seeking similarities and looking for differences. A quantitative approach will tend to emphasize what it is that is common, what common trends, what's in an average about that subject of research. Qualitative approaches many ways are about storytelling. Storytelling that we want to see as being profound, detailed, nice storytelling. It's about grasping the processes by which, in this case, value is created. You go in detail, and by going in detail, you look at the contextual situations that affect that specific case. It's all very about the specificities. It's about details. It's about how things happen. And therefore, what they emphasize is the differences. There's a huge book of Oxford University Press of contextual public analysis, that thick. So it's this issue that contexts matter. Contexts are different. Therefore, it's very difficult to abstract and think about generalities from this diverse situation. And so the problem is posed. How do we go about it? What kind of approach? What do we do? What I am suggesting is the approach you take very much becomes defined by the purpose, the objective of what you are going to do. So now we go finally to the issue of evaluation. So evaluation now is being justified. The rhetoric of evaluation is very similar across countries. And it's being justified in terms of the need to provide accountability. You can see this everywhere. So now I have a problem with this. Since accountability is a nasty little word. Because accountability can mean very different things. You can think of accountability as the need to audit the activities of a group. So make sure that this group, this researcher, does whatever he or she is saying he or she does. So that's accountability. It's a form of control. It's linked to audit. Or you can think of accountability as exactly the reverse, as saying, let's get these people to do whatever they feel they have to do to reach the objectives they have set for themselves. And what I'm going to look in the name of accountability is not going to audit their processes. I'm going to look at their performance by their objectives. So these are almost two contrary ways to look at accountability, and they are defined, expressed by the same word. That's why I said nasty little word, because this really is an entry point for a lot of confusion. So I don't want to say that the purpose of evaluation is accountability. It's like saying nothing. So what I propose instead is to look at evaluation in terms of their goals, and I would distinguish three main goals. One is the one I already mentioned, control. Make sure that, in this case, researchers do whatever they are supposed to do. The second one is improvement. I'm doing an evaluation to improve the way in which I am conducting my day-to-day business. The third one is the distribution of resources. I'm using an evaluation to inform or determine how resources will be distributed. Now, the point here is that these different purposes of evaluation fit with different systems of research governance. So, for instance, if you have a tenured system with a lot of core funding, Spanish way, then it is very difficult to adapt, tweak the system. Tenured researchers like myself are quite ungovernable. We do whatever we please. That's why we got the tenure in the first place. I have not been working all my life towards a tenure for now having some politician to tell me what to do. Oh, no. It's very difficult to steer the research of a governance structure that is based on a tenure core funding system. So what do? You control the process. You make sure that what is being done, that what these researchers at least do some research, do some work, that what they say they do it. And how do you do it? By extensive system of audit. In situations like the Spanish, when you think of evaluation, people immediately think about audit. And that's why you have now hundreds of Spanish researchers checking all over the world, asking for certificates. We always have to ask for certificates, because we have to show that we have been in the place we say we have been. The whole system is geared to a position, to a mechanism of audit. Now, this is very different if you have a research system where the weight of tenure and of core funding is lesser. If you have a more weight in project funding, in flexible allocation of funds, then you may have a bigger role for a distributive and an improvement function of research. For instance, in the UK, the research assessment exercise and the research excellence framework is a big tool of evaluation which is geared towards the distribution of funds. And for instance, also in the UK, there has been quite a bit of research, impact assessment so-called, for instance, in the Economic, Social and Research Council, that have focused on processes, on ways of doing things. And they were really thinking to justify, in part, what they were doing, but they were thinking of ways of tweaking the system. And that's why they were contracting, in part, this type of research. So if you want to carry out evaluative research with a view to improvement, then details matter. Then it's really under what conditions, under what context, that a specific activity does work or does not work. And it is then when you do a detailed analysis of the processes by which, in our case, in the matter that concerns us today, value, social value, is generated. And so the cases that, for instance, the Economic and Social Research Council generated, funded over the years, provided a big group of case studies, lots of storytelling that told us things. In fact, when you look at them, you can say, look, we can see that there is substantial engagement. In this case, was social sciences, was the SRC, was not humanities. We can see that there is a large diversity, and the way that the social value is generated depends on the context in which that the specific activity takes place. And you can see also that's an issue that has been stressed by Hera Value. I have done my homework, I have been looking. That the path to valorization is diffuse. There is an example that Paul always commonly presents, and I know this because you are on YouTube. So that's a problem. If you are on YouTube, I've seen the speeches of Paul Benneworth in YouTube. So I've been seeing you making this contrast between the diffuse paths of arts and humanities research, paths to application, and contrast them to biomedical research, in which you have a very clear pattern of application, very regulated, in which you go from analysis in vitro, in vivo, population clinical tests. The clinical tests are structured, so you have a very clear line. By no means this is diffuse. So this has implications. If our subject of research tends to be so diffuse in the way that a social value is generated, then we do have a problem. As Paul says, counting, enumerating transactions is almost impossible. They are so different. They are so dispersed. Many may be almost seem inconsequential, but there may be so many of them. It's very difficult. It's maybe impossible to devise a quantitative model of use of these paths to application. So we become interested in processes. What we really should be looking at is the way these things happen, because they are so diffuse. By looking into processes where our kind of methodology tends to be not exclusively, because there are quantitative analyses being presented here, but there is a bias towards qualitative research. It's that qualitative research that will give you the detail. And this interest in detail, in differentiation, in context, is very different from the interest of quantitative research, which tends to be about big patterns, about averages, about maybe, if we can, causalities. So it's a different approach. And so what we have now got to is to the big problem of the evaluation community in this area and in all areas. There is no evaluation paradigm. Very different things of answering evaluation questions. We are lacking an evaluation paradigm. So we have reached a quite depressing moment of the presentation, because this is very messy. So you have diversity of activities in arts and humanities, diversity of channels to value, to valorization, and diversity in the methodologies we may use to study these channels. This diversity in everything. So what do we do? No? Is there a way out of this? Well, I'm not trying to discover anything. I'm just suggesting a possibility of a channel out, something that really brings together the very different approaches that I've been talking about. There is something they have in common, commonalities. There is something they have in common. As there is an emerging consensus on the importance of interactions, of social interactions. And this is something that is good to underline, because it's becoming almost so common to refer to it that it's almost now a banality. But I think we have to reflect a bit on this. On the quantitative front, this, for instance, the research of Landry and Amara in several papers, they say that the model they favor is what they call the interactive model of technology transfer. So from a quantitative perspective, they identify the importance of interactions between researchers and so-called stakeholders, communities, to explain how and through what processes, in average, things do occur. So they are able to trace a bit with quantitative methodologies what happens, and it's the interactive approach, the interactive model, that explains better the commonalities we observe in this. And from a qualitative perspective, we always now tend to look at the interaction, at how the scientist relates with the stakeholder. To the point that in an European project in which I was involved until recently, CIAMPI, the whole methodology revolved around the idea that to assess impact, that was the title of the project, impact assessment, to assess impact, you had to identify and analyze what we call productive interactions. So it was not only that we were looking at interactions, it's that it was the building block of the methodology. And even going further, I mean, there has been arguments that this is an OECD report on the social sciences, in where there is a nice little chapter which it argues that the social sciences should first and foremost be regarded as local practices, something that is also taught very often from the arts and humanities. They are locally oriented. And the argument goes a bit further and says, and because they are locally oriented, we should really concentrate on the effects of the research on those local practices. And it will be later if there are indirect contributions to the more general environment. That will come later. It's not our first concern. Our main concern as social scientists should be to study local practices in local contexts and to do it in a participatory mode. So we are doing the research. It's not an issue of the impact afterwards. It's like we are doing the research with the participation of those we study. And other scholars have used much more fancier terms for this. Phronetic science. Yeah, so there's a phronetic. The phronetic basically means it's mode 2 to the extreme, I would think. Phronetic means that you carry out your research in collaboration with those who you are analyzing. That relationship constitutes the core of your social research. And if this is the case, then looking at interactions is not only a way of assessing, say, impact. It's a way of assessing the social research, social science itself. So we are going further here. Social science that's being evaluated through the analysis should be evaluated through the analysis of relationships. So, as we said, focus on processes is needed when you do this. So if you are looking at these interactions, then you have to look at processes. But if you look at processes, then this is associated, as we have already suggested before, to improvement functions. We are going in detail, we are looking at contextualities, we are trying to determine the small changes that explain that in one case a project has had impact, in another case maybe not. We are looking at context. And to do this, we have to do it in what the evaluation people call it a formative approach. Because really we cannot do this kind of work without the collaboration of those that are being evaluated. Because it's so much a matter of detail. We have to have a door open to what these guys are doing. So if we come as auditors really to smack them, those will be closed. So if we are thinking of a way of doing evaluation which focuses in process and in detail, we have to work with those that are being evaluated, and we have to take an approach which is formative. Now, what is the issue here? That this focus on processes yield detailed data that are useful for improvement, but they are problematic as a contribution for issues like evaluation, distribution. Why is this? When you try to use evaluation for controlling purposes and for distributive purposes, you try to narrow the number of things we are looking at. In the case of control, you cannot look only at a few things because they are the things that are able to be audited. In the case of distribution, you will be looking at things that you think can be compared. If we can compare them in a way that a formula can be created and then distribution of funds allocated through formula funding, right? I mean, that's what HEFKE in the UK was trying to do when they were thinking in the original thinking about the research excellence framework. Formula-based. If you have formula-based funding, the data on which it has to be based is quite narrow. And it has to be comparable. Only those things that are comparable we are going to look at. If, like it happens now in the UK, you realize that this is not possible, still, the data you are getting through your evaluation has to be comparable. That's why there has to be quite an effort made, as it's happening now, as we're speaking, in the UK, in the REF, about how you define the things. How you're going to build your cases. The REF says we're going to assess cases as a way of distributing funds. But those cases have to be structured in a very specific manner. And there is now a whole debate which is exploding about what does it really mean. How can you do these kind of things? How you can game it or not game it? Why? Because it has to be very structured. So stories, an approach that focuses on processes and focuses on diversity is not well suited to distributive functions. That's why HEFKE is having a problem with cases of impact for its distributive function, because it's trying to tell stories, use the stories for distributing money. Money is not well suited, and it's completely cannot be used for control. So it's formative. And it's formative means it's a form of evidence into the policy process. It's something you add to a process of policy definition and implementation that's very complex. And the evaluation is injected to work with those that implement in order to improve, maybe in a stepwise manner, the way they are doing things. And here, I would argue, and here I might divert a bit of the error value approach. I would argue that because this is the case, the definition of social value does not need to be solved a priori. It's a part and parcel of the specific evaluation. And now I'm going to the third part of my presentation. I was supposed to talk about social values. If our approach is contextual, the social value itself will depend on the context in which you are talking about. And that has, again, been, I think, quite well expressed, very well expressed, by Paul Brennerworth, who draws our attention to the fact that humanities research contributes to social development, but social development is a political question. So a value assessment of the arts and humanities needs to be explicit about the social development model to which you are supposing to be contributing. And this is a political question, in a way. The notions of what's valuable are debatable, can be debated, and in fact, should be debated. So evaluation from this perspective, then, cannot do more than contribute to a process of policy development based on argument and discussion. Right? If the same goals, if we accept that the goals are part of a political process and the political processes is based on debate, then what you do with evaluation of this kind is formative, is to contribute to a process of policy development, making, implementation that is based on evidence, argument, persuasion. So that's why I said that was thin end of the wedge. From a view of evaluation, now we move to a perspective of how policy should be. No? Humanities research, Paul has told us, cannot be measured in a way that can be considered by everybody as objective and fair, because there are disagreements. In other words, then if this happens, the role of evaluation and of impact assessment is not to provide final answers. You don't use evaluation to close the debate. You use evaluation, if anything, to open the debate and to help in a formative way to develop policies further. You don't provide final answers. You contribute to a process of policy development based on argument. And like this is a beautiful little book from the 1980s from Giandomenico Maggione about public policy as evidence, argument, and persuasion. Made in the Old Way is the book I was still using as my main book when I was teaching public policy some years ago. It's this different, it's a view of how policy needs, it's very normative, needs to be developed and implemented. So, to restate, I'm repeating this, but I think this is the main point, the main point of the argument. Although impact assessment and evaluation needs to be based on a concept of public value, this concept does not need to be cast in stone, does not need to be unique. And there has been previous messages in Hera Value that addressing the issue of public values of arts and humanity research requires trying to understand how publics conceptualize value and engage in research. But these publics will be different. Different contexts will have different views. And even they may disagree among themselves depending on the context in which you are doing your research. So understanding how this occurs becomes part of the evaluation. Understanding how values are generated, which values are shared, is part of the assessment of a specific activity of research and its value, say, its impacts on society, for instance, or its value generation. When you go on detail, specific, you go on this line of looking at the details and looking at the processes. Part of this looking at the processes and looking at the details is looking at the ways values are generated, or what values this group of stakeholders hold. So this strengthens this view of evaluation that we are proposing here. And today, that doesn't happen to me very much, but maybe it's this issue of the keynote speech. I'm being very normative. But it's also a way of getting more debate afterwards. We have a view here of evaluation, which is engage with researchers, engage with the stakeholders, aware of context, with an interest in processes, with an attention to those elements, contextual elements that may affect the way value is generated and used, and which is part of a bigger process of policy formation which is based in debate. And therefore, from this perspective, the view of policy, of evaluation where we are supporting, I am, in a way, arguing in favor of, is what the jargon in evaluation theory calls it formative. That's not very new. That evaluation of social sciences should be formative is something that, for instance, Stefan Kuhlmann said about 10 years ago. So I'm not really breaking new ground here. and just arguing in a slightly different way and taking a very roundabout way of getting to the same point he got 10 years ago. Now, and I should be finishing, this is easier said than done. You know, one thing is for me to go and say, yeah, you have to go, you know, context, importance of differences. Another thing is then in practice, when you have a politician that's asking for an evaluation, for instance, what do you do? When you have the commission who's paid for a program, they're going to ask you things that are going to be a bit different from what I have been saying this. So you have to work with this problem of a view of what evaluation probably should be about, and how your tasks are also defined by the requirements of the funder that may be different. And this is very difficult, and I guess today and tomorrow we will see ways of addressing these difficulties through the presentations we will attend. And of debate, because one thing I'm sure that the presentation I made today, somebody from a Treasury department would be extremely uncomfortable with. Because I'm not solving any of the problems that he has on the table or she has on the table, and would see another view, another way of thinking about evaluation. So we have a debate. But the only thing I'm saying, which is the final message, so to speak, is that we have to come to terms with the fact that a methodology or an approach that seeks to provide rich descriptions, which seeks to provide detailed analysis of how research contributes to the generation of social value, is particularly well suited to a kind of purpose of evaluation, to an objective of evaluation, and it is not well suited to other purposes. It's not well suited to distributive purposes or to controlling purposes. And that's why I think HEFKI is now hitting problems with case studies in the REF. And I'll leave it here, I think, in good time for a little bit of debate. Thanks.